Dennis Palumbo is an author and licensed psychotherapist. He's also a former Hollywood screenwriter. He co-wrote the award-winning movie My Favorite Year. Some of you probably remember Peter O'Toole, terrific film. He's also been on staff at some television sitcoms and written a number of pilots, but he's had a whole second career. In the last 20 years, he's been a licensed psychotherapist, working with Hollywood creative types, writers, actors, directors, producers. So he's really straddling both worlds of psychology and the arts and film and TV in Hollywood. And in addition, he's kept up his writing. He's the author of 4 mystery novels in a series about Daniel Rinaldi, who is a police psychologist in Pittsburgh. And his latest book is Phantom Limb, which is the latest in the Daniel Rinaldi mysteries. And in addition to being a terrific book, we think it would make a great TV show. And he also has written and taught on the craft of writing and the sort of the psychology of the writer's life in a book called Writing from the Inside Out, which I'll also have a copy of here. And this is a book that talks about the writer's process that we all go through as writers, the procrastination, the writer's block, the frustrations, the ups and downs. So that's the sort of the short bio of Dennis Palumbo. Welcome, Dennis.
It's so nice to be here, Hoyt. Thank you so much.
Dennis and I have known each other for a while, and but I'm looking forward today in talking to him to learn a lot more about his work and his life and how he got from Pittsburgh to Hollywood. So you were born in Pittsburgh.
Yeah,
Tell me about your family.
It's funny that at my age, I'm writing a series of books that take place in Pittsburgh. And I left Pittsburgh 40 years ago. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and I went to the University of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And after I left college, I had an English degree, which is very tough to get a job with an English degree if you're not a teacher.
Well, let me interrupt you just back a second, because you said you were born in Pittsburgh, and I think your dad owned a store. Was that what he did?
He had a grocery store, Palumbo Food Store,
okay.
Which I worked at from the age of 12.
Oh, you did?
And
you were the little guy behind the counter?
I was the little guy behind the counter slicing lunch meat for people. You know,
okay.
I was the one where they would say, "Oh, could you slice me this really thin?"
Yeah.
And I'd hold it up, and the old ladies would go, "That's not very thin." You know, so I'd go thinner and thinner. If you could see through it, especially the prosciutto.
Oh yeah.
Oh, the prosciutto had to be thin.
This is an Italian grocery store.
Oh, a very Italian grocery store.
Okay.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun working there.
Yeah, yeah. So did you go to, where'd you go to school? Did you go to Catholic school?
Yeah, I went to Catholic school, grade school,
okay.
and then a public high school.
Okay. Yeah, you made some comment to me earlier about the nuns. I forget what that is. You got to be on your best behavior, right?
Yes, you really, really did. You know, it's funny. The nuns were tough, but in their defense, we spent so many hours diagramming sentences that I think one of the reasons I tend to not make too many grammatical mistakes is I still imagine that ruler coming down on my knuckles. If I dangle a participle anywhere, we're in trouble. So
it's funny because I didn't go to Catholic school, but we learned in public school, we learned how to diagram sentences.
Yeah.
And as a writer, I find that's really useful.
I think it's
because I know what a verb and an adverb and a noun is.
It keeps your syntax nice and clean.
Yeah. So you finished up high school and you went to Pitt.
I went to Pitt, yeah.
Okay, well tell me about that.
Well, I love Pitt. It's a great urban campus.
Yeah.
It's in Oakland, and it's a real muscular kind of built low to the ground school, you know, with a really wonderful writing department.
Yeah.
And remember, I was in school in Pittsburgh at a time when there were still steel mills. I mean, when I was in college, I worked at J&L Steel on 2nd Avenue. And in the last 40 years, Pittsburgh's undergone such a renaissance. I mean, those mills are all long gone now.
Right. So the mills left, and they kind of
gentrified. I think because Pittsburgh is so heavily endowed with the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Scaifes, the Hineses, there was a lot of money put into the revitalization of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And as a result, now it has an amazing medical reputation. And it's the world's pioneer in nanotechnology. It's very white collar.
Right.
As I say in one of my books, it's a shot in a beer town colliding with the information age.
Yeah,
that's really what it is.
So, but when you were growing up, it was Italian grocery stores.
It was Italian grocery stores
mills.
and steel mills and cobblestone streets and streetcars.
And you were thinking then, I want to be out of here, or I want to be in Hollywood?
Well, I wanted to be a writer, and when I was in college, I didn't know any writers, and so, but I wanted to write, and I thought I'd be a novelist, actually. But when I left college with my English degree, the only work I could find was in an ad agency. So I worked in an ad agency and started writing and directing TV and radio commercials.
And that was in Pittsburgh?
That was in Louisville, Kentucky.
Okay.
And so then I realized I really liked, writing scripts.
Sure.
So my then wife and I, first wife and I, drove out to California.
Yeah.
And I said to her, give me a couple years to try to make it.
Wow.
And so.
Well, what was that decision like? I mean, you're sitting there in an ad agency in Louisville, and you think, well, I don't know anybody in Hollywood, but I really want to do this. So what was the?
It was terrifying.
Yeah.
There was a lot of gnashing of teeth and rending of garments, but
yeah.
I began to ask myself, what would I feel like if I never tried it?
Yeah.
And that was the only thing that got me to do it. Because I wanted to be able to look back and go, wow, at least I know what happened when I tried.
Yeah.
And I also was, that youth, when you're that young, you think you're immortal, you think you have everything in front of you, and why not you,
Yeah.
And so.
Well, I assume you didn't have a lot of writers in your family or anybody that was saying, go get them
in
Hollywood.
And when I think of writing in Hollywood, my model was the Dick Van Dyke Show. Yeah. I thought it was going to be me sitting on a couch with a couple other writers, and when I ended up finally writing on Welcome Back, Kotter, it was exactly like that, except none of us wore ties and jackets. But it was just like that.
Which I think is true of a lot of television writers, that they really train in their childhood by watching TV shows. I mean,
I think it was Carson's monologues and the Dick Van Dyke Show that taught me about television writing. Yeah.
All right, so then you throw all the luggage into the station wagon, and with your wife and maybe not a dog, I don't know.
No, just me and my first wife, and we came out to Hollywood, and it was a struggle, but I was very, very lucky. I couldn't get anyone to read me, so I went down to the Comedy Store and auditioned as a stand-up comic.
Right.
I was a terrible stand-up comic, but I got in for some reason. And I used to make extra money. The two things I did was I sold school supplies over the phone, which I was terrible at.
Yeah.
And I knew I was in trouble when I said to the boss, what are my leads? Do we have any leads?
Yeah.
And he came and he just dropped the Ohio phone book on my desk and said, that's your lead.
That's your lead.
And the other thing I did is I sold jokes to stand-up comics. And one night, Gabe Kaplan was in the audience and he saw my act and he said pretty much what everybody said, that I was a good writer and a bad comic.
Yeah.
And so.
Well, so who was around? I know you knew Gary Shandling at that point.
I knew Gary Shandling, and I knew David Letterman. I don't know whatever happened to him.
Yeah.
And I knew Kip Addotta, Freddie Prinze. I knew a lot of.
That was sort of the heyday, wasn't it, of the
very
comedy
much
clubs?
The heyday, and it was the time also where they were using stand-up comics after the model of Chico and the Man. The idea was to take a stand-up comic and build a sitcom around them. Right. I mean, they tried it with David Brenner. They tried it with so many different comics.
Yeah. And that's what happened with Welcome Back, Kotter?
Yeah, actually what happened with that was kind of interesting. I had found a writing partner, Mark Evanier, and he and I were writing spec scripts while I was on the road with Gabe writing jokes. Okay. Because I went on the road with Gabe Kaplan to work on his act. And the thing that was so fascinating about being on the road with Gabe is he would pay me $25 for every joke, but only if it got a laugh. And so we'd be like in the Playboy Club at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he'd do like a bunch of my jokes. And then afterwards, we'd sit down in the back and debate whether they got a laugh.
Counting laughs.
Yeah. And ultimately, I'm going to like the drunk at the next table. You laughed at that, didn't you? That was $25.
You need a shill in the back, to laugh.
I needed some hot bodies back there laughing.
That's right.
But actually, Gabe was pretty good to me because when an opportunity came to be story editor on Welcome Back, Kotter, my partner and I got the gig. It just shows how funny life is, because the reason we got the job on Welcome Back, Kotter was that Gary Shandling, who was the story editor, was in a terrible car accident and was in a hospital for 6 months.
Oh, wow.
So we got his job, and while he was in the hospital, he realized he didn't want to be a sitcom writer. He wanted to be a stand-up comic.
Yeah.
So both of our lives were transitioned around his car accident.
Yeah.
If he hadn't been hit by a car, he wouldn't be famous, and I wouldn't have had a career in Hollywood.
Well, what's it, I mean, I'm sure there's a big difference between when you were writing TV shows and what it's like today. I know you have a lot of clients who work on TV shows, writers and directors, producers and actors. What's it like to do that now versus then? Is it more corporate now? Or
well, the business has changed so radically. You know, I come from a time in the early 70s where the network would give you a pickup of 22 or 26 episodes,
right.
And unless you used, you know, swear words, they left you alone. Now they give you much smaller pickups, and every story has to be vetted by the studio and by the network. You have to give them an outline, you have to give them a treatment, they approve stories or don't approve stories. None of that happened.
Is the process the same? The room, is it basically
The room is
unchanged?
basically the same, the writer's room, which is usually there is the showrunner, who is the executive producer, and then co-executive producers and staff writers who all pitch stories, and they break the stories down and put them up on a whiteboard. And then usually one or two writers are assigned to go off and write the first draft. And then they come back, and then everybody works on making it funnier or tighter or whatever.
Do you think the pressures are different from when you were doing it now for the staff writer, let's say?
I think the pressures are about the same in the sense that, you know, if you're not doing well, you get yanked, but you still end up on another show. You know, it's sort of like still, once you're in the door, it's unlikely you're not going to be in the door.
It's kind of the Peter principle, isn't it?
Now, the other thing is there's also many more marketplaces. I mean, when I was in television, there were 3 networks. And so now, even if you know, get kicked off a network show, there's cable shows. And then there's premium cable shows, and there's syndicated shows. And so there's a lot of different places writers can work. And they do have to scramble a lot sometimes to find those jobs.
Well, it's encouraging in the sense that there's more work, really, isn't there?
Well, there is more work, though paradoxically, the staffs are smaller. And so sometimes it seems like staffing season, when writers are going out to get these jobs, it's really kind of brutal. Particularly because a lot of showrunners have a tendency to hire people they know.
Right. Well, and you also used to have the stable of freelance writers too, didn't you?
Yeah.
Which doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't exist anymore. In fact, when I was on Welcome Back, Kotter, half the scripts were written by freelance writers. And the reason that changed is because the staff writers, we knew the show so well, we would often rewrite the writers who had done the episode, the freelance guy, we'd rewrite the episode so completely, but the freelance writer's name would stay on the script. And as a result, people on staff started to complain. And so now more and more, I think
fewer freelancers.
There's very, very few freelance assignments.
Well, we did a little digression here, but let's go back to where you're on staff. So you got to Hollywood and you got successful. You got on staff of a TV show and you're probably making pretty good money at this point. You're supporting yourself. So then what's the transition into film?
Well, that was interesting.
My favorite year.
Well, my partner and I amicably split up because Mark wanted to do different kinds of things, and I didn't want to write sitcoms anymore. So I did end up working in a couple more television shows, but ultimately I got very, very lucky and pitched the story of My Favorite Year, and
which is what in a kind of a nutshell. Is it
drawn
drawn from your experience too?
Well, no. The only part that's drawn, the story is about an Errol Flynn type character who is going to be on a live comedy variety show in 1954. And this new young writer, who's the youngest writer on the staff of writers, is assigned the job of squiring him around town and making sure he stays out of trouble until the night of the performance. And so, you know, I was 3 years old in 1954. So, but the reason I wanted to do it with Errol Flynn is because he was my father's favorite movie star. And I always wondered what would it be like if Errol Flynn came to my house.
Yeah.
And so that's why that scene's in there.
But Peter O'Toole in a magnificent performance, drunk out of his mind.
I have to tell you, I was so happy and grateful because I wrote it for Peter O'Toole, the first draft.
Yeah.
And we were very, very lucky to get him 4 years later. Again, it just shows those weird confluences in Hollywood, because when they attached him at MGM to the film, I was long off the film.
Right.
Another writer had been brought in, Norman Steinberg, and Peter O'Toole had just been nominated for Best Actor for The Stuntman. So he was bankable for about 4 months.
Yeah.
And that's how come the movie got made.
It's funny because it's every intern's nightmare, isn't it? Being
Yeah.
assigned this guy.
Yeah.
And you know that if he jumps off the building, you'll lose your job.
That's right.
And you'll
That's
never
right.
work again. Well, that's great. So this is an award-winning screenplay, and you're kind of, boy, you're really doing well. You're on TV, you've done TV staff, you've done episodes, you've got a big movie. What happened?
Well, I'm going to give you the 5-minute version.
Okay.
My first marriage had ended, and I was in therapy, and I fell in love with the process. And at the same time, I was still working in show business and had gone as part of research on a film. I had gone to Nepal and lived in the Himalayas for 3 months, and I had a little bit of a razor's edge experience. I wanted to do something else that felt a little more meaningful to me in my life. And so when I came back...
Now, let's just back up on that. Was that, you're at the top of the mountain and you're thinking about the meaning of life, or?
Well, sort of version of that,
okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I was at the top of the mountain thinking about the meaning of life.
Yeah.
And having a wonderful time. Nepal was an unbelievable place.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was there, it was still, this is 1986 or 85, it was still a Hindu kingdom. You know, the king was an avatar of Vishnu. He was considered holy.
Yeah.
And that's all gone now, of course. So no, it was a remarkable experience, and it really changed me. I know it sounds like a cliche, but
well, it sounds
really
like
did.
you were also kind of turned off by what you were experiencing in Hollywood. Is that true?
Well, you know, it's funny. I would like to say that, except Hollywood was very good to me. I thought Hollywood was changing. The kinds of films I was interested in doing, they weren't doing anymore. After Jaws and Star Wars, films have become more and more tentpole, projects where you essentially use them to sell merchandise in video games.
Right.
So as an adult, it was starting to feel like they weren't making the movies that I wanted to make. I came out to Hollywood when there was, Chinatown and The Godfather and, a Little Big Man in The Conversation and Last Detail. This rich time in the early 70s in American cinema that we've never seen again. And so, but it would be, I think, too facile to say, oh, well, intellectually, the movies was not. It was not that. It really was the experience of being in therapy and working with other people. I had started to volunteer at psychiatric facilities and stuff while I was taking classes. And I just fell in love with doing it.
So you went for your license, you went to school.
Right.
You're probably one of the few people whose day job was writing for TV and film, and
that's
whose
right.
real avocation
was to be a therapist.
Yeah.
And nobody in Hollywood knew that I was doing this. And so it was kind of striking. I wasn't absolutely sure that I was going to change careers, but I'd already amassed enough for my degree, and I had almost all my clinical intern hours. And I had worked at that time, I was working at a psychiatric hospital working with schizophrenics. So I was at lunch at this restaurant called La Dome with this producer who was trying to get me to write a movie for him. And the whole time I kept looking at my watch because I was going to be late for the psychiatric hospital. And so I'm zooming down La Cienega and thinking, what's wrong with this picture? I couldn't wait to leave the producer. I couldn't wait to get to the hospital. And that was like my road to Damascus experience. I went, I'm changing my career.
Wow.
I'm going to be a therapist.
Well, you know, it's funny because, I mean, people know you now as somebody who's very successful and has a full roster of clients and is sort of a guru for the Hollywood creative community in terms of psychotherapy.
I should have worn my robes.
Yeah, really. But we got the beard, so
oh yeah, yes.
But that didn't happen overnight. I mean, I imagine building a psychotherapy practice, even when you're somewhat connected to Hollywood, is a challenge.
It's it was a big challenge. It was a little bit of a slow start, but I was very lucky again in that I had the opportunity to write a column for the Writers Guild magazine called Written By. And I wrote a monthly column called The Writer's Life, in which I talked about the psychological issues that writers struggle with. And I must say that built my practice. You know, it became a very popular feature in the magazine.
Yeah.
And that's where I built my practice.
So what's it like treating all these neurotic Hollywood types? I mean,
well, as a neurotic Hollywood type myself, no, they're no more neurotic than anyone else. The only difference between creative people and non-creative people is, for creative people, their interior worlds are the raw materials of their work. And so it's much more on the surface. You know, I mean, if a writer is depressed, he or she is going to write about a depressed character or describe their inner world. If a bricklayer is depressed, he's going to finish the job, the whistle blows, he goes and gets drunk. But they're both depressed.
Right. Are you saying, and maybe this is just my take on it, but there's certain occupational hazards with every occupation, whether you're bricklaying or you're creative. What are some of the occupational hazards for, and they're probably different between the writer, the director, the producer, the actor. I mean, is there something about the vocation that we've chosen?
Well, I think it's the uncertainty. I mean, a person can go to law school, get their degree, join a firm, and you know, if they do what they're supposed to do and they bring in the right amount of clients, they can work their way up to partner or whatever. There seem to be appropriate steps. There seems to be, whether you're an intern trying to be a doctor or a young lawyer trying to be a partner. For the creative artist, particularly in a commercial marketplace like ours, it's the uncertainty that is so difficult. There's no road that you follow. You do your best. Let's say you're a writer and you're trying to break into television. You write a spec pilot or a spec episode or whatever, and you hope someone will read it, you hope an agent will take you on, and if they don't, your only recourse is to write another one. You know, and AA has a saying that the definition of crazy is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And unfortunately, for creative people, it is the only way to make it. You keep doing the same thing over and over again, hoping you do get a different result. And the reality is, all you can do is keep giving them you until you is what they want.
Are there differences between the different niches in Hollywood? I mean, I would think actors would have a particular problem because it's them, it's their whole, it's their face, it's their body, it's their, you know, a writer. I guess it's the difference between in front of or behind the camera. Do you notice psychological differences there?
Yeah, I think that I always would imagine that for an actor, the actors I've treated, it is the personal rejection, not only just of their work, but of them, which often replicates feelings of inadequacy from their childhood. And you know, Hollywood's a place where how you look and sound is crucial. And whereas, you know, writers have at least one barrier between themselves and the marketplace. Though for most writers, their script is their baby.
It gets pretty personal.
And it gets very personal. And I remember one time a producer rejected a screenplay of mine, and I was so upset when I was a screenwriter, and my agent said, "For God's sake, don't take it personally." And I thought, well, how should I take it? Impersonally? There's no other way to take it. But after a while, you realize that the marketplace's decision about you and your work has very little to do with you, and has more to do with their needs at that particular time. And
yeah, I've had that experience as a producer or a director where an actor will come in on audition and they're just not right for it. They may be wonderful and talented, but they're just not right for the part that I have in mind.
Yeah.
And that's not a personal thing, but they take it personally, as they should,
Yeah,
because they've invested so much.
They've invested so much in it. I remember when we were on Welcome Back, Kotter, we would audition, actresses. For one role we had where a student teacher was going to be working with Gabe, and we had a number of wonderful actresses who came in, but they were taller than he was.
Yeah.
And so even though they were wonderful, we couldn't cast them.
Yeah.
And there's nothing they could have done to prepare for that, So I think the personal rejection and dealing with that is one of the hardest things to do.
On the positive side, I find that people who are in the arts, whether at whatever level, develop a sense of confidence and discipline. I mean, there's always the opposite, the flip side of this, but they develop a kind of a discipline and a perseverance, if they stick with it, that can be really useful in anything that they do.
That's exactly right.
I've got a number of actors I know who've gone into real estate, and they are bang-up successes because sales, they're great with that. And similarly with other professions. And in fact, I think it's true, and you probably agree, that it's great for actors, writers, and directors to be doing other things too. To have a life.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I think so. It's funny, I had mentioned sales, doing phone sales. The people who did the best in the phone sales department were stand-up comics who were trying to break in. They were amazing on the phone. They made people laugh, but they were aggressive, and they had big, big sales.
Yeah. Does it, I mean, as a therapist sitting on the other side of the couch, how is it for you, because, I mean, you've really been there in a sense as a creative, but how is it that you professionally deal with that? I mean, guiding people with their careers or their ups and downs, what is it that you personally, how do you personally approach that?
Well, remember, I'm a therapist. I'm not a life coach, and I'm not a career counselor.
Right.
So there's very little career advice involved. If a patient is having a difficult time with his or her agent, rather than say, maybe you should get a new agent, what I would explore is the personal issues going on with my patient.
Yeah.
The expectation that their agent is going to be a parent figure to them.
Right.
Or the expectation that if their agent doesn't call them back, it means they don't like them. I mean, I work with the psychological landscape of creative people.
You once said to me, I think, that there's such a thing as healthy narcissism, and a little bit of healthy narcissism is important when you're in a creative field because it's part of your motivation. Do you find that's true, or is there a line that people cross?
Well, of course, there's always a line that people can cross, particularly in Hollywood. But when I think of healthy narcissism, I think of it more as a sense of entitlement, that you are as entitled as anyone else to pursue your goals.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think you have to have a responsibility to your gift. So where I think people get in trouble is if they confuse the money or the plaudits that they're getting with their work.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that saves a creative person's butt is doing their work. Trends come and go, agents come and go, deals come and go, but if you have a really good, solid relationship with your creative process, that can help you weather a lot of the storms.
Well, Dennis, we're going to talk some more in our next segment about the creative process, and I'm also going to explore a little bit of the celebrity culture that we're talking about. What happens when the spotlight gets shined too brightly on somebody who can't handle it. And I also want to talk to you about your books.
Oh, excellent.
So we're gonna come back shortly and talk about all that.
Excellent.
Great to have you.
Happy to be here.